All right. Hey, everyone. So for this PowerPoint, we're going to get into the Great Depression. And so it is quite telling that throughout the 1920s, America sees an economic boom, especially towards the beginning part of the decade called the Roaring Twenties. But all of that starts to crash down towards the tail end of the decade in 1929. And so the United States throughout the 30s and early 40s will go through a rough economic period called the Great Depression. So let's get into that right now. So when people think about the Great Depression 100 years ago, or close to 100 years ago, many people don't quite know exactly why the Great Depression started or the ins and outs of it. We know that the stock market crashed, and even I'll admit myself that I don't know every single ins and outs of the stock market especially when it comes to speculation and underconsumption. But it is important to know that whenever an economy or a country produces way too many items and there's not enough customers or the items don't sell quickly enough, it starts to cause a lot of devaluation and overproduction, which is not good for the economy. And so this is what happens in the 1920s, that we produce way too many goods. So, for example, the farmers overproduce. I have a nice little map of the price of the crops that rise and then takes a sudden fall towards the latter part of the 20s and early 30s. So there was widespread switch from horse-drawn to mechanized farm equipment. So technology is constantly advancing. We're not using horses as much. We're turning towards machines that allows us to mass produce materials. For example, we also talked about the making of cars with Henry Ford and the assembly line. So we are having more workers producing a lot more goods. Back to the farmers, instead of them making more money, it leads to overproduction that leads to major price reductions. And so in economics, you'll talk and learn more about supply and demand. And whenever there is a huge supply of an item, the price of it goes down because there's so many of it. There's no need to increase the price. However, if a good is scarce and it's not around and it's very important and essential, then that will lead to the price to go up and the demand to go up as well. Perfect example of this. Currently, we're going through the COVID-19, also known as the coronavirus. And I'm sure you've heard in the news about toilet paper, hand sanitizer being sold out in stores. For example, if one store had just one bottle of hand sanitizer and many people want that hand sanitizer, it will cause the price for hand sanitizer to increase. But if there are, thousands of hand sanitizers and we weren't going through a panic, then the price of hand sanitizer will, decrease. But anyways, back to the overproduction, it leads to major price reductions and it causes farmers to lose money and the inability to pay back farm loans. And so many farmers, they don't have an expense or an abundance of cash, like physical cash on them to just pay off a loan. And so they need to borrow money. But of course, in order to, whenever you borrow something, you have to return it at some point. And so if they're not able to get the money from their farms, then they're not going to be able to pay back their loans and it will lead into bankruptcy. And so the result of farmers failing to pay back loans led many small towns, which were rural and majority of jobs are agriculture and farm based. It led to their banks to fail. And once a bank fails, especially back in the day, it causes a chain reaction and a strain for other banks to start to fail as well. And so banks were just starting to run out of money. And that caused a huge panic throughout the 1920s or late part of the 1920s into the 1930s. So if we think that we're panicking now, it was pretty rough a century ago. So even though there was more efficient machinery in factories and on farms led to overproduction, many American citizens had the money to purchase these goods. So it's never a good thing to have too much of an item, and at the same time, people not having enough money to go out and buy products. And so the average consumer had very little buying power to purchase goods. So you're just, if you go into the stores, you're just having, so many items that are not being sold. And the purpose of items in a store is to, of course, be bought by the consumer. And so this phenomenon is called underconsumption. And when people don't have enough money to buy things over a period of time, it'll lead to lower prices. But with lower prices, it starts to hurt many farmers and manufacturers who are not making enough money back from the products that are being sold. And so, the question down here, what happens to factory workers if the product they produce isn't being purchased? Those bosses in the companies, they're going to have to make some tough decisions, and they're going to have to lay off some people. So this slide going over some causes of the Great Depression, a few of them that we've already talked about. Overproduction and low demand leads to employee layoffs. And so, perfect example today with the COVID-19 and coronavirus, it leads to people being socially distant. And that's, of course, advice given by the CDC and the World Health Organization and through the administration recently. And so with social distancing, people are more aware of, not going out as much. And so when people don't go out as much, it leads to people not, using their money to go and buy food and dine in at restaurants. And so the restaurant business is heavily suffering. And so low demand and their food not being bought in the restaurants, of course, the waiters and waitresses and the cooks, they're going to have a tough time making money, and several people are going to be, or thousands of people are going to be laid off for a little while. Also, low wages reduce consumer buying power. Once again, if you don't have enough money to buy anything, you're not going to buy anything, and the stores aren't going to sell items, and they're just sitting there, and that's not a good thing. Also, high tariffs restrict foreign demand for American goods. So if you're living in France and the American government places a high tariff, on watches or cars, then, a foreign citizen that's living in France or Brazil or Japan, they don't want to buy a more expensive American product. They'll just buy locally. Also, unemployment reduces buying power even further. So when factories, they're not selling enough products, it's going to lead them to lose money. And so the bosses are going to have to cut ties. They're going to have to lay off some people. And what happens to those laid off people? They're not going to get a check in the mail or in their accounts. So they're going to have to be more wise on spending. And so the whole spending part is buying power. And if you don't have buying power, you're not going to go out and purchase items and restrict yourself financially. And so this whole entire process is a cyclical effect, and it's just a continuous cycle. And so this is a picture in New York City on Wall Street when the stock market crashes in 1929, and hundreds of thousands of people flood the streets to protest, and it causes a lot of chaos. Another key reason for the economy to tank in 1929, in the late 1920s, many Americans began to invest heavily in the stock market. Stocks give the owner the ability to share in the profits. So if a company does well or suffer losses, if a company does poorly. So depending on, let's say if you buy stock in Coca-Cola, and not let's say, I don't know, you put in $100 for Coca-Cola as a stock, and if Coca-Cola's value increases, you can always sell your stock, and let's say it does 4 times better, 4 times 100, $400, you sell it, and bam, you made a $300 profit. But if Coca-Cola has a poor sales year and their stock plummets, you could lose money at the same time. So it's all a risk. That's why it's called speculation, because you're speculating, you're taking a guess on how you are investing in the stock market. Me personally, I don't have any stocks. I'm not gonna basically endorse anybody to get into stocks or not endorse people to buy in stocks, but it's just has not been my thing. So speculators were those who try to make quick money on the stock market, and so put in fast money, hopefully to get a quick reward. Many speculators or investors bought stock on the margin, and what that means is that speculators, the investors, borrowed money to buy stocks. And once again, there's that term, borrowing. So it's not really your money, and so it is a huge risk that you are taking. So this only works if the stock prices goes up, but it is disastrous if the stock prices fall. It's just basically placing a bet. If you bet that the Los Angeles Lakers are going to win the NBA title and you put $100 on it, if they lose, you're out of the $100, and so it's always a risk. And so many speculators in the 1920s borrowed 90% of the stock's value. That is a huge percentage. So I have down here an example. If a stock costs $100, you would borrow $90 because 90 divided by 100, 90%. So if the stock price began to fall, you would then have to pay back the money you borrowed, which many speculators did not have. Also, one thing that does not help the economy is due to Mother Nature. Throughout the 1930s in the Great Plains area, the United States suffers a heavy drought, which is called the Dust Bowl. And so I have pictures. Here's a map here of the areas that were severely affected by the Dust Bowl. It starts out in Kansas, but it then blows over into Texas, parts of Nebraska, Colorado, the Dakotas. And so the drought here, this is where a big majority of our agriculture and farmland is located. And so, of course, already the farmers aren't doing that great financially. And then they're hit even further with the drought. And of course, drought means you can't, that's dry weather, not getting a lot of rain. And so not having a lot of rain results in crops not growing. And if the crops don't grow, you're not going to be able to sell anything at the stores. So, of course, many farmers were already unable to pay back their loans, and many people stopped planting crops. And so, beginning in 1932, a drought hit the Great Plains, turning much of the topsoil into dust with the lack of rain and crops, and the wind blew the dried soil for hundreds of miles. And so, there's a huge, sandstorm and dust storm. And so, when the topsoil gets turned over, it basically means that you cannot grow any more crops on terrible soil. So it just does not help the farmers at all. And so there are some pictures out there in which the dust storm, the sandstorms basically cover entire houses from the bottom to all the way to the roof. It was that serious. So who was president at that time? Well, it's a gentleman named Herbert Hoover, and he was a Republican that entered office in the mid 1920s. I think he won in the 1924 presidential election, and so he was president during the stock market crash. And so there's a picture of Herbert Hoover, and then here's a picture of a slum that was created as a result of the stock market crash. People lost their jobs, and so they were evicted from their homes or apartments, and they basically had to start from scratch. And these little slum towns were called Hoovervilles, and of course the word Hooverville derives from the president Herbert Hoover to kind of make a mockery of him. But the important thing to know is whenever an economy doesn't do well or does great, many people turn to the president for answers. And if it does well, we praise the president and the administration. If it doesn't do well, the president is often the first one to get criticized. But it's very important to know that when it comes to the economy, one person does not control the entire system. It is more complicated than that. But of course, it is the first thing or first person that many people turn to. And so throughout the 1930s, during the Great Depression, many photographers, Great Depression era photographers, went around the Great Plains region and just took photos of people's everyday lives. This is probably the most famous picture of the Great Depression. It's called Migrant Mother. It was taken by Dorothea Lange. And I believe the woman that was pictured here, she has two kids. I believe she was in her mid-30s when this photo was taken, but it was taken, I think, in Oklahoma, and so she was trying to find work out in the West, and it was just tough times. And there's many photos taken during the Great Depression. You can go check them out, and they're very quite telling and emotional. Have another, nice little, had to toss in a meme there for the SpongeBob followers. And SpongeBob has a lot of relatable content that can be associated with various points in throughout history, as you probably are already familiar with. Another quite famous photo during the Great Depression era is this photo here. In the background, it says world's highest standard of living, but unemployment at this time peaks at roughly 20 to 25%. And there's no way like the American way. And so, this photo, there's a lot of things to observe here. The photo or the cartoon back here, it shows a picture of obviously a middle class, upper class, wealthy white family, while those that were hit hardest were minorities, African Americans, Asian Americans, Hispanic Americans. And so it's a bit contradictory to call ourselves at the time the world's highest standard of living, while a quarter of the population was unemployed or underemployed. As more workers lost their jobs, they were unable to pay their rent or mortgage. And so when that happens, people get evicted. And there was a new class of homeless began to build shacks on the outskirts of cities called shantytowns or Hoovervilles. And of course, question here, why did people call shantytowns Hoovervilles? Well, it was to try to poke at Herbert Hoover and blame him for their despair. So with an election coming up in 1932, it's going to be between Herbert Hoover and Franklin D. Roosevelt. And so based on this, what's going on in the economy, it's not really tough to guess who will win. And that, of course, will be President or Franklin D. Roosevelt. He was the governor of New York State. And this map is quite telling, with the economy not doing well and people blaming Herbert Hoover for the Depression. He gets destroyed in the popular votes and the electoral votes. Franklin D. Roosevelt, a member of the Democratic Party. He wins in 1932. He gains 472 electoral votes compared to Herbert Hoover's 59, and he wins the popular vote by over 7 million people. So it was a landslide victory. And President Roosevelt will be the longest serving president in U.S. history, serving nearly 4 terms before he passes away in 1945 in the state of Georgia. But we will talk about his legacy and his accomplishments at a later time. And so that is all I have for this slideshow. Thank you for tuning in. If you have any questions regarding what was gone over, make sure to send me an email. Check out the assignments on Verge and Google Classroom. And yeah, thanks for tuning in, you guys.